The sun hung low in the sky, casting a fiery orange glow over the vast expanse of the Danakil Depression, stretching out across the borders of Ethiopia, Djibouti, and Eritrea. The land here seemed both impossibly barren and boundlessly beautiful. It was a place where life clung to survival in its purest form, where the relentless heat and the whispering winds sculpted both the land and the people who called it home. Samir, a young boy of the Afar tribe, sat on a weathered rock overlooking the dry plains. The sand stretched endlessly before him, interrupted only by the jagged rocks that jutted out like forgotten monuments to the past. In the distance, a herd of camels moved steadily across the horizon, their long, graceful necks swaying with each careful step. Samir's eyes followed the camels, his mind racing with thoughts of the stories his grandfather, Haji, had told him. Haji was the oldest and most respected elder in their village, a man whose face bore the deep lines of wisdom and years spent under the harsh sun. It was said that he had once traveled as far as the Red Sea, seeking out knowledge of the world beyond the desert. But no matter how far Haji went, he always returned to the desert, where the Afar people had lived for centuries. "Samir, come," Haji called from the doorway of their small, thatched hut. His voice was gentle, but carried a weight that demanded attention. Samir jumped up and hurried toward his grandfather, eager to hear another tale of the Afar's ancient customs. Inside the hut, the air was thick with the smell of burning incense and the earthy scent of dried meat hanging from the rafters. Haji sat on a low stool, his hands resting on a carved walking stick, the wood worn smooth from years of use. He motioned for Samir to sit at his feet, a place of honor in their culture. "Tell me, grandfather, what is it about the desert that makes us Afar who we are?" Samir asked, his voice filled with curiosity. Haji chuckled softly, the sound rich with the weight of his many years. "The desert, my boy, is both a mother and a harsh taskmaster. It gives us life and demands that we respect it. The Afar people have lived here for thousands of years, adapting to the land in ways that no other people could. We understand the winds, the sun, the rhythm of the sand, and the animals who call this place home." As Haji spoke, Samir's mind wandered to the images of his people, their simple, sturdy homes made from woven palm fronds and animal hides, their brightly colored garments reflecting the fierce sunlight. The Afar people were a nomadic tribe, moving from place to place in search of water and grazing land for their livestock. Their lives were shaped by the seasons, by the migrations of their herds, and by the constant struggle for survival in one of the harshest environments on Earth. For centuries, the Afar had lived this way, following the ancient ways of their ancestors. They were known as the people of the salt, for they harvested the precious salt from the vast salt flats that stretched out across the Danakil Depression. Salt was their currency, their lifeblood. It was used in trade with neighboring tribes and communities, and it was also essential for preserving the meat of their animals in the blistering heat. In the mornings, the men would set out to the salt flats, where the ground shimmered white under the rising sun. The women, dressed in brightly colored shawls, would gather around the waterholes, tending to the children and collecting herbs and medicinal plants. Samir's mother, a strong and graceful woman named Amina, would always take him with her to the waterholes. It was there that Samir had learned how to gather the herbs that could heal wounds, soothe the sick, and protect against the harsh elements. "The desert teaches us more than just how to survive," Haji continued, his voice low and thoughtful. "It teaches us how to respect life. The Afar people know the importance of family, of community. Without each other, we would not survive. We are connected not just by blood, but by the land itself." Samir looked out the door of the hut, his eyes tracing the endless horizon. He could hear the distant calls of the camels, the soft bleating of the goats, and the occasional whinny of the horses. It was a sound that filled him with a sense of peace, as though the desert itself was alive and breathing. He wondered what it would be like to live as his ancestors had, roaming the desert in search of water and food. guided by the stars and the rhythms of the earth. At that moment, a young girl came running toward the hut, her feet kicking up a cloud of dust as she approached. It was Samir's younger sister, Fariha, her dark hair flying behind her like a black flag. She was holding a bundle of herbs in her arms, proud smile on her face. "I found the best herbs." "Samir," she called, her voice filled with excitement. "Mother will be so happy." Samir grinned and stood up to meet her. "You've become quite the herbalist. Fariha, perhaps you will one day become a healer like our mother." Fariha's eyes sparkled with mischief. "Maybe I will," she said, tossing her head. "But I think I would rather become a warrior like father." Samir laughed, knowing that their father, Hassan, was a man of strength and courage, respected by all who knew him. Hassan had taught Samir how to ride a camel, how to track animals across the desert, and how to fight with a spear. But despite his father's warrior spirit, Samir knew that their true strength came from the unity of their people. The Afar were a people who valued not just physical prowess, but wisdom, kindness, and a deep understanding of their environment. As the day wore on, Samir and Fariha joined their mother at the waterhole, where the women were busy preparing a meal of grilled goat meat and flatbread. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the desert. The air was cooler now, the heat of the day beginning to recede. "Tell me again, Mother," Samir asked, as they sat down to eat. "How do we know when it is time to move to the next oasis?" Amina smiled, her dark eyes sparkling with the same wisdom that filled Haji's voice. "We watch the stars, Samir. We listen to the winds. We know the signs of the desert. When the winds shift, when the animals begin to behave differently, when the stars move in the sky, these are the signs that tell us when it is time to move. And we move together, as one." Samir nodded, feeling a sense of pride well up inside him. The Afar were not just survivors. They were people who had learned to live in harmony with the desert, understanding its rhythms and its secrets. They were a tribe shaped by the land, and the land, in turn, had shaped them. As the night descended over the desert, the stars above seemed to pulse with an ancient energy. Samir lay on his back, his eyes tracing the constellations that his ancestors had followed for centuries. He felt a deep connection to the world around him, a connection that went beyond the physical, something ancient, something eternal. In that moment, Samir understood. He understood why the desert was both a mother and a taskmaster. He understood why the Afar people had survived here, in this harsh and unforgiving land. They had survived because they had learned to live with the desert, not against it. And as he gazed up at the stars, he knew that his journey had only just begun. Samir stood up, brushing the dust off his knees as he made his way down to the village. His thoughts lingered on the stories his grandfather had shared with him the previous night. Haji had spoken of the ancient rituals that connected the Afar people to the very essence of the land. But Samir was restless, eager to see the things his grandfather had only described in words. He longed to witness the full extent of the Afar way of life, to understand its nuances, its deep-seated rituals, and the timeless wisdom that had carried the tribe through the centuries. As he approached the village, the familiar sight of his people going about their daily tasks came into view. Women were gathering water from the well, their faces covered with colorful scarves to shield themselves from the harsh sun. Children played nearby, their laughter ringing in the dry air as they chased after goats and camels. The men, strong and weathered by years of toil, were busy preparing the herds for the long trek to the salt flats. The village was a simple collection of thatched huts made from palm leaves, carefully constructed to offer some respite from the blistering heat. Despite its modest appearance, it was home to a tight-knit community that had weathered countless challenges over the centuries. The Afar had learned to adapt to the unforgiving landscape, finding ways to survive in a place that many would consider inhospitable. It was a life of balance, of respect for the land, and of reliance on each other. Samir approached his father, who was sitting under the shade of a large acacia tree, mending the leather straps of his camel saddle. He was a man of few words, but his presence was commanding, and his eyes always seemed to carry the weight of responsibility. His name was Idris, and he was known throughout the village as a skilled herder and a wise leader. "Father," Samir called out, his voice carrying across the quiet morning air. Idris looked up, his stern face softening as he saw his son approaching. "Ah, Samir, you're up early today." "I couldn't sleep. I've been thinking about the stories grandfather told me. I want to learn more. I want to see it for myself," Samir said eagerly. Idris chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You're growing up too quickly. You want to see what? The desert is not something to be taken lightly. Can be beautiful, yes, but it is also dangerous. It demands respect." Samir nodded, his eyes filled with determination. "I know, father. I'm ready." Idris placed the saddle on the ground and stood up, wiping his hands on his tunic. "If you're ready, then come. Today, I'll show you something that will help you understand our people better." They walked together toward the outskirts of the village, where the first of the herds had begun to assemble. The camels were lined up in neat rows, their long, gangly legs bending gracefully as they shifted in the heat. Samir could feel the sand burning under his feet, but he didn't mind. The desert was his home, and every grain of sand felt familiar, like an old friend. Idris motioned for Samir to follow him as they made their way toward a small group of men standing by a large fire. The men were dressed in simple, flowing robes, and their faces were hidden behind scarves to protect against the dust and sun. They were in the midst of preparing for a journey, a long trek to the salt flats, where the Afar people harvested one of their most valuable resources: salt. Salt was not only essential to the Afar's survival, but it also played a key role in their trade with neighboring tribes. The salt from the Afar region was prized for its purity and taste, and it was transported across great distances to be exchanged for goods like grain, livestock, and weapons. For generations, the Afar had lived off the land, using its resources in a way that was sustainable and respectful of the delicate balance that existed between man and nature. Samir watched in awe as the men began to prepare the camels for the journey. They tied bundles of salt to the animals' backs, making sure each load was secure. The camels, accustomed to the weight, stood stoically as their handlers worked with swift, practiced hands. "This is how we survive," Idris said quietly, his voice filled with a deep sense of pride. "The desert gives us what we need, but we must take care not to take too much. The salt we gather here will be traded, but it's also a way for us to honor the land. We must always remember that." Samir nodded, understanding the weight of his father's words. It wasn't just about surviving. It was about living in harmony with the land, about understanding the rhythms of the earth and respecting its limits. As the preparations continued, Idris led Samir to a small stone outcrop overlooking the salt flats. From here, the vast expanse of white salt stretched out in every direction, glistening under the harsh sun like an ocean of ice. It was a stunning sight, one that seemed to go on forever. Samir could see the shimmering mirages in the distance, where the heat caused the horizon to bend and warp. "This is where we come to harvest the salt," Idris said, his voice reverberating in the stillness. "But it is not just a resource. It is part of us, part of our heritage. Without it, we would not survive. Without it, we would not be Afar." Samir's eyes widened as he took in the landscape before him. He had seen the salt flats many times before, but never from this vantage point. It was as if the entire world was contained within the white expanse, a world that was both ancient and ever-changing, where the past and present intertwined. "Remember this, Samir," Idris said, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "The salt you see here is not just something we collect. It is a symbol of the resilience of our people. It is a gift from the earth, and it is our duty to protect it." Samir stood there, looking out over the salt flats, feeling a deep sense of connection to the land and to his people. The Afar way of life was more than just survival. It was a testament to the strength of the human spirit, to the ability to adapt and thrive in even the harshest of conditions. And as he stood there beside his father, Samir knew that he was part of something much larger than himself, a timeless legacy that had endured through the ages. As the day wore on and the preparations continued, Samir's thoughts turned to the stories his grandfather had shared. He had learned of the Afar's ancient customs, their rituals, and their deep connection to the desert. But now, standing on the edge of the salt flats, he realized that these stories were not just tales of the past. They were living, breathing parts of his world. They were the foundation of his identity, the framework upon which his people had built their lives. And as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the salt flats, Samir made a silent promise to himself. He would learn, he would grow, and he would honor the legacy of his ancestors. For in the vastness of the desert, amidst the silence and the heat, he had found something more precious than gold. He had found his place in the world. The day was beginning to wear on, and the sun's oppressive heat had started to recede slightly as evening approached. Samir, having helped with the herd and finished his chores for the day, now stood beside the fire where the men of the village were gathered. The smoke from the fire curled up into the air, blending with the haze of the desert in the distance. The men were talking in low voices, their faces serious, as the sounds of their laughter and stories from earlier in the day faded into the background. Samir's curiosity couldn't be quelled, so he approached his grandfather, who was sitting by the fire, his ancient face illuminated by the flickering flames. Haji noticed his grandson's approach and beckoned him over with a wave of his hand. "You seem troubled, my boy," Haji said with a knowing smile, his voice steady and calm, like the desert winds that whispered through the night. "I'm not troubled, grandfather," Samir replied. "I just want to understand more. The stories you told me, they are fascinating, but I feel there is more, something deeper, that I don't yet see." Haji chuckled softly, the sound deep and resonant. "Ah, so the young ones are always eager to know more. But be careful, Samir. The desert has a way of hiding its truths. What you seek may not be what you expect." Samir sat down beside his grandfather, his eyes wide with anticipation. "What do you mean, grandfather? The desert," Haji began slowly, "is not just land and sand. It is a living thing. The Afar people have always understood this. We have learned to live with it, not fight it. The earth provides us with everything we need: food, water, shelter, but only when we are willing to listen to it." Samir was quiet for a moment, processing his grandfather's words. He had always known that the Afar people had a deep connection to the desert, but he hadn't fully understood the extent of it. "But what about the salt flats? Why do we go there to gather salt every year?" Haji's eyes seemed to gleam in the firelight, and he leaned forward, his voice growing more intense. "Ah, the salt flats, they are the heart of our people. For centuries, we have traded salt with other tribes and communities, not just as a commodity, but as a symbol of life. Without salt, we would not survive. But there is more to it. The salt flats are a place of transformation, where one's understanding of the world can change." Samir could feel a shiver run down his spine as his grandfather spoke. He had heard stories of the salt flats before, how they stretched endlessly, as white and blinding as snow, and how the Afar people would trek for days to reach them. But he had never considered the spiritual significance of the place. As the night wore on, Haji continued to speak, his words painting a vivid picture of the Afar people's journey across the harsh desert. Samir listened intently, absorbing every word. He learned of the traditions that had been passed down through generations, how the men of the tribe would carve the salt blocks from the earth, how they would trade them with neighboring tribes, and how the salt represented more than just survival. It represented the endurance and resilience of the Afar spirit. "The salt is like our blood, Samir," Haji said, his voice softer now, almost a whisper. "It connects us to the earth and to each other, keeps us strong, even in the most difficult of times." Samir nodded, a sense of reverence washing over him. He had always known that the Afar people were tough, capable of enduring the harshest conditions, but he had never understood the full depth of their connection to the land. This, he realized, was why the Afar survived when so many others had perished in the same unforgiving environment. The next morning, as dawn broke over the horizon, Samir set out with his grandfather and the other men of the tribe. They were headed for the salt flats, a journey that would take several days. The camels were packed with supplies, and the men carried their weapons, as well as the tools they would need to harvest the salt. As they traveled across the desert, Samir couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. The vast emptiness stretched out before him, and yet he could feel the pulse of life in the air. The sun, hot and unforgiving, beat down on them, but Samir no longer saw it as an enemy. It was a part of the land, a part of their life. For the next several days, the group journeyed across the desert, each day seeming to blur into the next as the men pushed forward. Driven by the promise of the salt flats, Samir grew accustomed to the rhythm of the journey, the slow, deliberate steps of the camels, the sound of their feet crunching in the sand, the occasional rustling of the wind as it whispered across the barren landscape. They passed through valleys and over dunes, each day drawing them closer to the salt flats. On the fourth day of the journey, they finally arrived. The salt flats stretched out before them, a vast expanse of white that seemed to glow under the midday sun. Samir's breath caught in his throat as he gazed at the sight. It was unlike anything he had ever seen. The earth here was cracked and parched, and yet there was a sense of purity, of life, that emanated from the land. The men quickly set to work, their hands deftly carving the salt from the earth. Samir watched, fascinated by the skill and precision with which they worked. He had always known that the salt was important to their survival, but now he understood that it was more than just a resource. It was a symbol of the Afar people's strength, resilience, and connection to the land. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the salt flats, Samir felt a deep sense of peace. He had learned more than he ever expected on this journey. The desert, with all its challenges, was not just a place to survive, it was a place where the Afar people thrived, where their connection to the earth was as vital as the very salt they harvested. That night, as the fire crackled and the men gathered around to rest, Samir sat beside his grandfather, feeling a quiet sense of pride. He had witnessed firsthand the heart of his people's way of life, and he now understood what it meant to be Afar. The desert was not just a place of struggle, it was a place of life, of survival, and of transformation. It was the foundation of everything the Afar people were, and Samir knew that it would always be with him, no matter where he went. The days of the journey to the salt flats had passed in a blur of grueling heat, bone-dry winds, and endless stretches of white earth. Samir had learned much during those days, but nothing prepared him for the moment when they returned to the village. For things were different now. The winds of change were blowing across the Afar community, and their peaceful, familiar existence was about to be tested. As Samir approached the village with his father, he noticed the tension in the air. The men and women were gathered in small groups, speaking in hushed voices. Their faces, usually full of laughter and life, were now etched with worry. Even the children, normally full of energy, seemed unusually quiet, casting furtive glances at the elders as they passed. "What is happening, Father?" Samir asked, his voice filled with concern. "Why does the village feel so different today?" Idris glanced at his son, his face grim. "There is something coming, Samir. I can feel it in the air. Something unfamiliar." The two of them walked towards the center of the village, where the elders were gathered, their faces tense. As they arrived, Samir noticed that Haji was there, his usual calm demeanor replaced with a look of deep thought. The old man beckoned them over, and Samir took a seat beside him, eager to learn what was going on. "Grandfather, what is happening?" Samir asked, his voice low. Haji looked at him with a mixture of concern and understanding. "The world is changing, Samir. There are rumors of strangers coming to the desert, outsiders who seek the resources we hold dear, salt, water, and the knowledge of our people. There are talks of trade and even conflict. The Afar have lived in isolation for centuries, but that may soon change." Samir's heart raced at the words. He had always known that the Afar were a proud and independent people, but the idea of outsiders coming into their land, disrupting the delicate balance of their lives, felt like a betrayal. He turned to his father, seeking answers. "What are we to do, Father?" he asked. "Should we welcome them, or should we defend our way of life?" Idris sat down beside Samir, his expression stern but thoughtful. "The elders are divided. Some believe we should embrace the outsiders, make trade agreements, and gain what we can from them. Others, like myself, believe we must remain strong and protect what is ours. Our way of life is not something to be bargained for." Samir nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of the situation. The Afar were known for their toughness, their ability to endure, but this was something different. This was not about survival against nature. This was about the very soul of their people. That evening, the village gathered for a council meeting. The fire crackled in the center of the village, its light casting long shadows on the faces of the elders and the young men and women who sat around it. The tension in the air was palpable as the village chief, a man named Hamid, stood to address the group. "We have heard the rumors," Hamid said, his voice carrying across the gathering. "Outsiders are coming to our land. They come with promises of trade, of resources, and perhaps even of protection. But they also come with demands. They will not come here out of kindness, but out of need. We must decide what to do." A murmur of voices filled the air as the elders debated the issue. Some argued for peaceful negotiation, hoping that the outsiders would bring prosperity and new opportunities to the Afar people. Others, like Samir's father, argued that the Afar must defend their land, their way of life, against these foreign invaders. Samir sat in silence, his mind racing with thoughts. He had never imagined such a thing would happen in his lifetime. The desert, the land he had known all his life, seemed so vast, so unyielding, that he couldn't fathom how anyone could want to come to it. But now, he understood. The world was changing, and the Afar were caught in its winds. The council meeting lasted late into the night, but no decision was reached. The elders agreed to wait and see what the outsiders would bring. But Samir could sense the unease in the village. People were no longer sure of what the future held, and that uncertainty spread like a wildfire through the camp. The next few days were marked by a strange quiet. The usual bustle of daily life had slowed. The men still tended to the herds, but their movements seemed more cautious. The women still gathered water, but their conversations were muted, as if they feared speaking too openly. And the children, once full of energy, seemed to sense the tension and played only in small groups, avoiding the adults' serious conversations. Samir, too, found himself filled with a sense of unease. He had been raised to understand the land, to respect the desert, but this new threat was something he could not understand. How could outsiders, with their strange ways and foreign desires, fit into the world of the Afar? How could they remain true to their ancient traditions if they were forced to change by the pressures of the outside world? One afternoon, as Samir wandered through the village, he saw his grandfather sitting alone near the edge of the camp, his eyes gazing out into the desert. Samir approached quietly, not wanting to disturb the old man's thoughts, but Haji turned to him with a smile, as though he had been expecting him. "Grandfather," Samir said, taking a seat beside him, "what do you think will happen?" Haji was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Finally, he spoke. "Change is inevitable. Samir," he said softly, "the desert may be vast, but the world beyond it is vast as well. The Afar have always adapted. We have survived because we understand the rhythms of the earth. But we must also understand the rhythms of the world beyond the earth. The outsiders are coming, and they may offer us new opportunities, but they may also take from us what we hold dear. We must decide how much we are willing to give, and how much we are willing to protect." Samir listened carefully, his mind turning over the old man's words. He had always thought of the desert as something constant, something unchanging, but now he saw that it, too, was part of a larger world, one that was shifting and evolving, and the Afar, for all their strength, would have to adapt to survive. That night, as Samir lay in his bed under the canopy of stars, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something that would change everything. The winds of change had already begun to blow, and there was no turning back. The sky had turned dark by the time the Council of Elders had gathered at the heart of the village. The stars above, cold and distant, looked down upon the desert, casting an eerie light on the gathering below. Samir, standing at the edge of the group, felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. For the first time, he truly understood the power of his grandfather's words. Haji, as always, was calm in the face of uncertainty. His voice, though aged, carried the authority that only years of experience could bring. "The winds of change have swept through our lands," Haji said, his eyes scanning the faces of the tribe. "But we must not allow them to scatter us to the winds. We must stand firm, like the desert rocks that have withstood the ages." The tension in the air was palpable. The Afar people had lived in isolation for generations, preserving their culture, their traditions, and their way of life. But now, outsiders were encroaching on their land. The government had proposed a new development project that would drastically alter the region, threatening not only their livelihood but their very existence. The salt flats, their primary source of income, were at risk of being taken over, and with it, their centuries-old trade routes. For weeks, the elders had deliberated on the issue, seeking a solution that would protect their way of life while adapting to the changing world. But as Samir looked around the circle of faces, he saw the deep worry in his people's eyes. The uncertainty of the future hung heavy on their shoulders. "It's not just the salt, my son," Idris said quietly as he stood beside Samir, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's the way of life that is slipping away. Our ancestors fought for this land, and we are the last ones who can protect it. If we don't act, we could lose everything we hold dear." Samir nodded, his heart pounding. He had always known that change was inevitable, that no culture or people could remain untouched by time. But he had never imagined that his own tribe, the Afar, would be caught in the crossfire of modernity's relentless march. The Elders' Council discussed for hours, weighing the options before them. Should they fight for their land, risking violent confrontation with the authorities? Or should they find a way to coexist with the new forces at play? The debates were heated, but eventually, a decision was made. The Afar people would not give up without a fight, but they would not be driven to violence either. They would use their voices, their traditions, and their deep connection to the land as their weapons. Haji, who had remained silent through much of the debate, finally spoke again, his voice steady and commanding. "We are not just a people of the desert. We are the desert, and we will not be forgotten." With those words, the tribe's resolve was set. The Afar people would not allow their land, their culture, and their identity to be erased by outsiders. They would fight for their heritage, not with weapons, but with the strength of their unity and the wisdom of their ancestors. In the weeks that followed, Samir and his family worked tirelessly alongside their fellow villagers, organizing protests and petitions, They traveled to the cities to speak with government officials, sharing their stories and the history of their people. Slowly but surely, their message began to resonate. The government, though slow to act, started to take notice of the Afar tribe's determination and commitment to preserving their way of life. In the end, the project was delayed, and the Afar people were granted the right to continue using the salt flats. But more than that, the world had come to recognize their struggle, their connection to the land, and their resilience. The story of the Afar, a people who had lived for centuries in the harshest conditions, had spread far and wide, and with it, a new sense of pride and purpose was born. For Samir, the journey had been one of discovery. He had learned that change was inevitable, but it was not something to fear. The Afar people had survived for centuries because they had adapted while never losing sight of who they were. As Samir stood beside his grandfather, looking out over the desert that stretched endlessly before them, he knew that the future of the Afar was secure. Haji placed a hand on Samir's shoulder, his weathered fingers strong but gentle. "You have learned well, my boy," he said with a smile. "You will carry our legacy forward." And with that, Samir realized that he, too, was a part of the desert's eternal story. The winds may change, the world may shift, but the Afar people, like the desert itself, would endure. Their culture, their traditions, and their way of life woven into the very fabric of the land.